For number 10, there's a lot of missing pieces, I guess you could say, in these equations. So we don't know what A is, we don't know what B is, we don't know what C is, and we also do not know what D is. So with that, we're going to use the concepts of what we know about these problems in order to help us answer those things. In number 1, it says, if the limit as x approaches 2 of this function f of x equals 4, find a relationship between A and B. Some people were a little confused about what a relationship meant. All that it means is find an equation that relates A and B to each other so that if I know one of the variables, I can figure out what the other variable is. So in this case, if you plug in 2 everywhere you see an x, in the numerator you get A times 2 squared, which is 4, minus B, which I wrote here. In the denominator, if you plug in 2, you get 2 squared, which is 4 minus 16, so negative 12, which I wrote here. And we know that the limit equals 4, so I just wrote that it equaled 4. And honestly, it doesn't matter if you solve for A or if you solve for B. All you need to do is find a relationship between them. So write an equation where if I knew what A was, I could just plug it in and find B, or vice versa. It doesn't matter which one you solve for. If you would have solved for B, you would have gotten, if you would have solved for A, you would have gotten B minus 48 over 4. So you could have left it like that. For part B, notice these words. In addition, it says if in addition, so not only is the first one true, but they're also saying now this is also true. So if the limit as x approaches negative 1 equals 8, now actually find the values of A and B. So notice that we can do the same thing. We plug in negative 1 to this function again. So A times negative 1 is 1A, and then minus B. If you plug in negative 1 to the bottom, you get negative 1 squared minus 16, that's negative 15, and that equals 8. And then notice again I solved for B, so I just isolated B by itself. And using that, what is that called now, where we have two equations and they both have an A and a B in them? What's that called? A system of equations. So you can either solve it by substitution or elimination. I solved it by substitution, so I set them equal to each other. Since it's B equals this and B equals that, I set them equal to each other and solved for A. And then once I knew what A was, I just plugged it back in to the function in order to solve for B. So they're saying that A and B, question A and question B, are related to each other in the sense that both of these things are true. Now use both of that information that you found in order to figure out the actual variables A and B. Any questions so far? Why did I multiply what? I'm sorry?
Like, how'd you get the 48 for A? I did not. I wasn't watching.
12 times 4, 48. So I multiplied 12 over to this side, and then subtracted the 4A, and then divided by negative to get the B by itself. All right, part C. A lot of people were confused about part C, but it's probably the easiest question on the entire back side. Part C says the limit as x goes to infinity. What's the first thing you should think of as you see a limit going to infinity? A horizontal asymptote. Every time you see x goes to infinity, you think horizontal asymptote. So looking back up at f of x, what's the degree of the numerator? 2. What's the degree of the denominator? 2. So we're looking at the ratio of the leading coefficients. So what's the coefficient of the numerator? A. And what's the coefficient of the denominator? 1. And now we know what A is. A is 24. So it's just 24 divided by 1, which is 24. So there is a horizontal asymptote at y equals 24, and the graph will follow that horizontal asymptote because the degree of the numerator and the degree of denominator are equal to each other. So it's the ratio of the leading coefficients, A divided by 1. All right. This last one is a weird one. It's weird in the sense that if you like puzzles and brain games and things like that, it's a good problem. If you don't like them, it probably frustrated you. So, a couple things about this last one. Number 1, it says find the limit as x approaches 4 of g of x. It tells you the limit as x approaches 4 of g of x is 2. It says find c and d. Looking at this function, if we plug in 4 everywhere we see an x, on the top I get 4 squared minus c times 4 plus d, and then on the bottom I get 4 squared minus 4. What's 4 squared minus 4? 0, so that makes it undefined, right? So here's what's interesting about this, is that it looks kind of like maybe I want to factor this, but I don't know what C is and I don't know what D is. So it's almost impossible for me to factor this now. So what we're going to do is we're going to force it to work for us so that we can find out what C and D is so that it works for us automatically and we can actually make it work for us. So what is the denominator factor to? What is x squared minus 16 factor to? X plus 4, x minus 4. So notice right here, that's what I wrote. X plus 4, x minus 4. We okay with that? All right. Now I'm trying to plug in a limit of x going to 4. So which one of these factors is giving me an issue when I plug in 4? This one's giving me an issue when I plug in 4. So my goal is to get rid of that factor. And the only way I can get rid of it is if there's another one of those x minus 4s in the numerator so that I can cancel them out. All right, because remember, anytime you can cancel it, it's just a whole, and it will help us to evaluate our limit from there. So what I'm doing is I'm forcing it. I'm forcing it to cancel out by writing another one of these factors in the numerator. So far, so good? Okay. Now, I don't know what the other factor is. I know that it starts with an x, because when I multiply it back to be up here, x times x, here, x times x is going to be x squared. All right, so I know that that has to be an x. But I have no idea what h is because I don't know what c is and I don't know what d is. So there's no way for me to figure out what h is yet. But here's what I do know. I do know that if I go forward with the problem and I cancel out these factors that are giving me zeros, okay, now I have x plus h over x plus 4. Okay, that's what's left. And if I try to evaluate the limit now, so the limit as x goes to 4 of this function, it should equal 2. Right? It should equal 2 because that's what it told me my limit equaled when I plugged in 4. So if I plug in 2 to this now, if I plug in 4 to this now, I get 4 plus h over 8, and that should equal 2. So I solved for h so I could go backwards and kind of figure out what h was. So let me scroll down a little so you guys can see that. So I actually solved for h and I said, okay, multiply 8 over to this side, I get 16. Subtract 4, and I get 12. So I know that h is equal to 12. I know that kind of looks like an n, but it's an h. So h is equal to 12. So now if I come back to this step again, I didn't know what h was before, but now I do. I know that it has to be 12, because that's the only way that the limit will equal 2 if I plug in 4. So if h is 12 now, I can multiply these back together again. So first would be x squared, outside is 12x, inside is negative 4x, which adds to 8, and then last would be negative 48. And now they want to know what's C and what's D. Well, C is the middle term, so C would be 8. And in this case, it's negative 8 because at the top it was, here, let me write what it was up there. At the top it was x squared minus cx plus d over x squared minus 16. So notice that it's minus cx, and because it's a positive 8 here, that means that that 8 must have been negative to begin with. So a negative made a positive. And then minus 48, since it was plus d, we just say that d is negative 48 in that case. That one's a tricky one. That one kind of makes you work backwards. I will tell you this, though, the diagnostic questions, this question from the diagnostic is almost identical, except for different numbers. So I can't promise that all the multiple choice are identical, but this one, at least, is almost identical except for different numbers. So if you just study the patterns of what happened and the procedure of what happened, you should be fine.